For 40 years, everyone in Marshall County, Kansas, knew the same thing about the Driscoll Quarter. Nothing grows there. It was 160 acres of prime-looking farmland on a gentle south-facing slope 3 miles north of Marysville. The soil looked right. The drainage looked right. The elevation, the exposure, the rainfall, everything looked right. But nothing grew there. Not well, not consistently, not enough to make a living. Corn that should have yielded 160 bushels came in at 80. Soybeans that should have made 45 bushels barely hit 20. Wheat was better, maybe 30 bushels in a good year, but even wheat struggled on the Driscoll Quarter in ways that nobody could explain. The land had been in the Driscoll family since 1901. 4 generations had tried to farm it. 4 generations had failed. Old Raymond Driscoll, who'd farmed it from 1948 to 1986, had a theory. "Bad luck," he said. "Some land is just unlucky. God made the rest of Marshall County for farming, and made this quarter for punishment." Raymond's son, Dale, had a different theory. "Bad soil," he said. "Something's wrong with it. Always has been. The clay's different here. Heavier, meaner." The neighbors had the most common theory. Cursed. The Driscoll Quarter is cursed. Nobody said it seriously, not out loud, not in so many words. But the idea was there, underneath the jokes and the headshakes and the knowing looks that people exchanged when Dale's name came up at the co-op. Poor Dale. Farming the cursed quarter. Might as well try to grow corn on a parking lot. Dale Driscoll was 58 years old in 2009, and he was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The deep, bone-level tired of a man who has spent 23 years fighting a piece of land and losing. He woke up every morning at 5:15 and walked to the kitchen and looked out the window at the field and felt the same thing he'd felt every morning for 23 years. A mixture of obligation and dread that sat in his stomach like a stone. The field was there. The field was always there. And the field was always wrong. His wife, Lorraine, set his coffee on the counter every morning without a word, because the words had been used up years ago. In the early years, she'd said things like, "It'll be better next year, and maybe we should try the new hybrid." And Dale had tried, and it hadn't been better, and the new hybrid hadn't helped, and eventually the words stopped, because they both knew the words were just sounds that filled the space where hope used to be. He'd tried everything, every hybrid, every fertilizer program, every tillage system. He'd put in drain tile in 1994, $42,000, borrowed at 8.5%, paid off over 12 years, because the extension agent said poor drainage was the problem. The tile helped a little, maybe 5 bushels per acre. Not enough. He'd switched from moldboard plowing to chisel plowing in 1997 because a neighbor said it improved his soil structure. Dale's yield stayed the same. He'd tried no-till in 2003. The weeds ate him alive, and he went back to chisel plowing after 1 year. He'd hired a soil consultant in 2001, a man from Topeka, who drove a white pickup with a magnetic sign on the door that said Precision Soil Solutions, and who charged $2,500 to walk the field with a probe, and declare that the soil structure was adequate and the nutrient levels were acceptable, and that Dale should consider switching to a variable rate fertilizer application program using GPS-guided equipment. The consultant had tested NPK levels, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the big 3, the holy trinity of soil fertility that every farmer, every agronomist, and every extension agent had been taught to test since the Green Revolution of the 1960s. The NPK levels were fine. They'd always been fine. The nitrogen was adequate. The phosphorus was moderate. The potassium was sufficient. The consultant charged Dale $2,500, shook his hand, and drove his white pickup back to Topeka. Dale didn't have GPS-guided equipment. Dale had a 1,987 Case IH 7,110 with 11,000 hours on it, and a 6-row planter that was older than his marriage. The tractor needed new injectors, and the planter needed new seed plates, and Dale needed a reason to keep going, and nobody was selling any of those things at a price he could afford. By 2009, Dale was considering selling, not because he wanted to, because he couldn't afford not to. His yields were half the county average. His input costs were the same as everyone else's. He was losing money every year, $15,000 to $25,000, depending on commodity prices, and the only thing keeping the farm alive was his wife Lorraine's job as a nurse at the hospital in Marysville. That's when his daughter came home. Her name was Sarah. She was 26 years old. She had a degree in agronomy from Kansas State University, a master's in soil science, and a job offer from Monsanto that would pay her $78,000 a year to work in their research station in St. Louis. She turned it down. She came home instead, moved back into her old bedroom, hung her diplomas on the wall next to her 4-H ribbons and her FFA jacket, and told her father she wanted to figure out what was wrong with the Driscoll quarter. Dale looked at her like she'd suggested lighting the barn on fire. "Sarah," he said, "I've been trying to figure out what's wrong with that field for 23 years. Your grandfather tried for 38 years before me. His father tried for 47 years before that. The field doesn't work. That's all there is to it." Sarah sat down at the kitchen table. She had a soil probe, a sample bag, and a form from the Kansas State Soil Testing Laboratory. The test cost $18. "Dad," she said, "have you ever sent a full-panel soil test to K-State? Not just NPK. Full panel. Micronutrients, heavy metals, organic matter, pH profile by depth, cation exchange capacity, everything." Dale stared at her. "No," he said. We tested the soil. The extension agent tested it, the consultant tested it. They all said the nutrients were fine." Sarah shook her head. "They tested nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Maybe pH. That's like going to the doctor and testing your blood pressure and nothing else. You could have cancer and they'd tell you you're healthy because your blood pressure is 120/80. Dale was quiet. "It costs $18, Sarah said. $18. And if it doesn't find anything, I'll take the Monsanto job and you can sell the farm and we'll never talk about it again." Dale looked at his daughter. She had Lorraine's stubbornness and Raymond's eyes, and something else, something that had skipped a generation or two, a willingness to ask the question that nobody else would ask. "Fine," he said. $18. Sarah went to the field the next morning. She didn't take one sample, she took 47. She walked the entire 160 acres on a grid pattern, taking a 1-2-inch core every 100 yards. She bagged each sample separately, labeled it with GPS coordinates from her phone, and drove the whole lot to the K-State Extension office in Marysville. The woman at the Extension office, a clerk named Dorothy, who'd been filing soil test forms for 30 years, looked at the stack of 47 sample bags and said, "Honey, that's the most samples I've ever seen from one field." Sarah smiled. "I want to know everything," she said. Dorothy looked at the full panel test form Sarah had filled out. Not just NPK. Everything. Major nutrients, secondary nutrients, micronutrients, trace elements, heavy metals, organic matter, pH at 4 depths, cation exchange capacity, base saturation, electrical conductivity, boron, manganese, zinc, copper, iron, molybdenum, chloride, sulfur. The test cost $18 per sample, 47 samples, $846 total. That was a lot of money for a woman who'd just turned down a $78,000 salary. Sarah paid it with the last of her savings from her graduate assistantship. The full panel results came back in 3 weeks. Sarah cleared the kitchen table, moved the salt and pepper, moved the napkin holder that Lorraine's mother had given them in 1988, moved the stack of farm journal magazines that Dale never read but couldn't throw away, and spread the reports across the surface. 47 pages, 47 soil profiles, each one a detailed chemical portrait of a specific point in the field. She read them all, twice. The first time quickly, scanning for patterns. The second time slowly, with a highlighter, marking any value that fell outside the normal range. The nitrogen was fine. Green highlight. Normal. The phosphorus was fine. Green highlight. Normal. The potassium was fine. Green highlight. Normal. The calcium was fine. The magnesium was fine. The sulfur was fine. The pH was 6.4 to 6.8 across the field. Normal. Fine. Acceptable. The organic matter was 3.1%. Low but not unusual for central Kansas. Everything that every extension agent, every consultant, every agronomist had ever tested was within normal parameters. The field was nutritionally adequate. And then she got to the micronutrient panel. Zinc, 1.8 ppm, normal. Manganese, 24 parti per milione, normal. Iron, 11 ppm, normal. Copper, beer.3 ppm, normal. Boron, 0.2 ppm. Sarah stopped. She put down her highlighter. She picked up a reference sheet from her K-State soil science textbook, a table showing the critical levels for all essential plant micronutrients. Boron. Critical level. 1 parts per million. Deficiency threshold. 0.5 parts per million. Severe deficiency. Below 0.3 parts per million. 0.2 ppm. She checked the next sample. 0.2 parts per million. The next. 0.2 parts per million. The next. 0.19 parts per million. All 47 samples. Every single one. Boron levels between 0.15 and 0.24 parts per million. Uniformly deficient. Catastrophically low. 1/10 of what corn needs to grow. Then she started laughing. Not a ha-ha laugh. A different kind of laugh. The kind of laugh that comes when you've been searching for something complicated and find something simple. So simple that it's almost offensive. So simple that you want to grab every extension agent, every soil consultant, every farmer who had ever looked at the Driscoll quarter and shaken their head and scream the answer in their faces. Boron. The Driscoll quarter was deficient in boron, not nitrogen, not phosphorus, not potassium, not any of the macronutrients that every standard soil test measures. Boron. A trace micronutrient that plants need in tiny amounts, about 1 to 2 parts per million, but absolutely cannot grow without. The Driscoll quarter had boron levels of 0.2 parts per million, 1/10 of the minimum requirement, across the entire 160 acres. Uniformly deficient. Every sample, every depth. The rest of Marshall County had boron levels between 1 and 1.8 parts per million. Normal. Adequate. The geological formation that underlaid most of the county, a limestone and shale deposit from the Permian era, naturally contained boron that leached into the soil over millions of years. But the Driscoll quarter sat on a different formation. A pocket of sandstone, a glacial deposit from the Pleistocene, that contained almost no boron. The boundary between the two formations ran almost exactly along the property lines of the Driscoll quarter, as if geology had drawn a map of misery specifically for one family. Sarah calculated the cost of fixing the problem. Borax. 20 Mule Team Borax. The same stuff you can buy at the grocery store for $5 a box, applied at a rate of 1.5 pounds per acre. 160 acres times 1.5 pounds equaled 240 pounds of borax. at $0.30 per pound from an agricultural supply company. Total cost, $72. Dale sat at the kitchen table and stared at the number his daughter had written on the back of an envelope. $72, he said. Sarah nodded. 40 years, Dale said. His voice was very quiet. 40 years of losing money. 40 years of being the joke at the co-op. 40 years of watching my neighbors pull 160 bushels while I pulled 80. 40 years of my father telling me the land was cursed. And the answer was $72 worth of borax. Sarah didn't say anything. She put her hand on her father's arm. Dale cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. He just sat there at the kitchen table with tears running down his face, looking at the number on the envelope, adding up the decades of lost income in his head. At $80 per acre in lost yield times 160 acres times 40 years, the Driscoll quarter had left approximately $2 million on the table, for want of 240 pounds of borax. They applied the borax in March of 2010. Sarah mixed it with the spring fertilizer pass, calibrated the rate to 1.5 pounds per acre, and ran the spreader across all 160 acres in one afternoon. It took 3 hours. 3 hours to apply a fix that should have been applied in 1969, or 1949, or 1901, when the first Driscoll looked at his stunted wheat and shook his head and decided the land was just bad. The borax dissolved into the soil with the first rain. It disappeared into the ground, the way $72 disappears into a farm operation, invisibly, silently, without ceremony or announcement. Dale didn't expect miracles. Sarah had warned him that the first year might show modest improvement as the boron levels stabilized and the soil biology adjusted. Give it time, she said. The soil has been starving for 100 years. It needs to relearn how to eat. But the results were visible by June. The corn was different, not just bigger, different. The color was deeper, a rich, saturated green that Dale had seen in his neighbor's fields but never in his own. The stalks were thicker. The leaves were wider. The plants had the look of corn that knows where it is and likes being there, rooted, confident, alive in a way that Dale had never seen on his own land. Boron is involved in cell wall formation, pollen viability, sugar transport, and root growth. Without adequate boron, corn plants develop weak cell walls, poor pollen development, incomplete ear fill, and shallow root systems. Every symptom that the Driscoll quarter had shown for 108 years, stunted growth, poor ear fill, weak stalks, low yields, was a textbook description of chronic boron deficiency. Every extension agent who had tested the field had tested the wrong things. They'd tested what they expected to be wrong, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and found nothing wrong because nothing was wrong with those nutrients. They'd never tested what they didn't know to look for. It was like a doctor who keeps testing your blood pressure because that's what the form says to test, while the patient slowly goes deaf from an ear infection that nobody thought to check. By August, the ears were forming. Full ears, tight rows, heavy kernels. Dale walked the field every evening, pulling back husks, counting kernel rows, feeling the weight of the ears. 16 rows, 18 rows. Some ears had 20 rows he'd never seen, 20 rows on the Driscoll quarter, ever. Lorraine walked with him one evening. She hadn't walked the field with him in years. The field had been a source of pain for so long that she avoided it the way you avoid a room where something bad happened. But Sarah had told her about the corn, and Lorraine needed to see it for herself. They stood in the middle of the field at sunset. The corn was taller than Dale. The leaves touched his shoulders. He could hear the plants growing, not literally, but in the sense that everything around him was alive and pushing upward with an urgency that he could feel in his chest. "Dale," Lorraine said. He looked at her. She was crying, not sad tears. Something else. Relief. the relief of a woman who had spent 23 years watching her husband lose a fight and had just realized that the fight was over. In October, Dale harvested the Driscoll quarter for the 24th time in his life. The yield monitor on his combine, one luxury he'd allowed himself, read 152 bushels per acre. Dale stopped the combine in the middle of the field. He sat in the cab and watched the number on the screen. 152 bushels per acre. He'd never seen triple digits on this field. His personal best had been 94. In 2004, a year when every other farm in the county had hit 180. He sat in the cab for a long time. The engine idled. The grain tank was half full of corn that shouldn't exist. Corn that had grown in cursed soil that turned out to be nothing more than hungry soil. Soil that had been starving for a mineral you could buy at the grocery store. Dale called Sarah on his cell phone. 152, he said. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, that's the first year. The boron levels will stabilize next year. You'll do better." She was right. In 2011, the Driscoll quarter yielded 171 bushels per acre. In 2012, the drought year that crushed most of Kansas, it yielded 118, which was still higher than the county average of 95. By 2015, it was consistently hitting 175 to 185, matching or exceeding every other farm in Marshall County. The cursed quarter was producing. Dale retired in 2018. Sarah took over the farm. She expanded it to 400 acres. She installed GPS-guided, variable-rate application equipment, the kind the consultant had recommended in 2001, when the problem wasn't the equipment, it was the diagnosis. The co-op stopped making jokes about the Driscoll quarter. Not because anyone said anything, because there was nothing to joke about anymore. Sarah gives a talk at the Marshall County Farm Bureau every January. She brings a small glass jar with her. Inside the jar is 1.5 pounds of borax. White crystalline powder. It looks like salt. She holds it up and says the same thing every year. This is $72 worth of an answer that took 40 years to find. Not because the answer was hidden, because nobody asked the right question. Everyone tested what they expected to be wrong. Nobody tested what they didn't know to look for. She pauses. The most expensive mistake in farming isn't buying the wrong equipment or planting the wrong seed. It's assuming you know what the problem is. The jar of borax sits on the shelf in the workshop, next to the $18 soil test receipt from 2009. The Driscoll quarter produced 188 bushels per acre last year, the highest yield in Marshall County. The curse was never a curse. It was a question that nobody asked for 108 years, and the answer cost $18.